Chapter 25, Return to the Cave. James Rickton sat impatiently on the wagon, holding tightly to the reins of the horses, waiting for Caleb and Nico's return. It seemed that Caleb had one more item to gather before they made their trip out to the cave. "Come on, you two, we got to get moving. We are already a half hour behind the others," hollered Rickton. Nico and Peter were standing outside the Elgin's home, waiting for Caleb, who had just went inside a few minutes ago. "Caleb, Mr. Rickton's calling you. He says you got to get moving," warned Peter, as Nico continued showing him pointers on improving his archery skills. "Found it," yelled Caleb from inside the house, as he came out with his backpack on, and a small bag in his hand, as he walked over to where Peter and Nico were standing on the edge of the porch. "Here, Peter, take this," said Caleb, as he reached in the bag and handed Peter a small black two-way radio, of which Peter had no idea what it was, since he had never seen one before. Peter looked at the radio curiously. "What is this?" "It's called a radio. You can talk through it, to people who are far away," explained Caleb. Peter gave him a puzzled look. "Watch, I'll show you. Turn it on here," continued Caleb, giving instructions to Peter on how to use the radio. "Then you have to push this button to talk to someone, like this," demonstrated Caleb, as he also turned on his radio. "Hello, Peter, can you hear me?" said Caleb, pushing the side button and talking through his radio, as his voice began coming out of Peter's radio. Peter's eyes widened as he and Nico grinned simultaneously. "I got it. Wow, that's neat," exclaimed Peter. "How do these things work?" Peter asked. "I don't know exactly. I found them in the cave along with a bunch of other stuff. They had them all wrapped up tightly. I guess that's probably why they still work. Anyway, you must lay it in the sunlight for a little while each day to charge it up, and make sure you turn it off at night when you're not using it," continued Caleb, showing Peter how to turn it on and off. "Keep this radio with you, Peter, while we go out to the cave. Keep it turned on, and I will have this radio with me, and we can keep in touch with you that way. You can also clip it onto your pants with this clip," explained Caleb, demonstrating to Peter how to clip it onto something. Peter nodded, and then tapped Caleb on the shoulder as he had turned around to clip his radio onto his backpack. "Caleb, if you find any more of these out there, grab some of them and bring them back with you," urged Peter. "We could have some fun with these." "I will. Just make sure you don't lose this one," scolded Caleb. "Come on, boys," scolded James Rickton, hollering from the wagon. "We've got to go, now." Caleb finished checking his backpack, as he and Nico climbed up onto the wagon, where Mr. Rickton had been waiting. James Rickton flicked the reins up into the air with both hands, as the two horses took off at a trot. They headed up the main trail, past the Daniels house, and onto one of the older trails that he and Stephen had always taken to the cave. This would be a longer trail, but would be much better for the wagons, as the other trail was far too narrow and would be difficult for such a wide and heavy load. "Good luck, boys. We'll see you three back here in a couple of hours," yelled Redding. As Caleb and the others passed by the Daniels house, they noticed that there were still about a dozen men gathered, most likely discussing how to deal with the Scavengers. Once the three of them were out of sight of the rest of the camp and well on their way down the trail, Caleb unclipped the radio off his backpack and turned it on. "Peter, can you hear me? Peter, do you have your radio turned on?" repeated Caleb. "Hi, Caleb, I can hear you really well. Sorry I took so long to answer. I forgot about having to first push the button like you said," said Peter. "That's okay. Now make sure you leave the radio on. I will check in with you occasionally. I don't really know just how far away these will work." "I'll call you again later," said Caleb, returning the radio to his pack. James Rickton looked over at Caleb, and then raised his eyebrows as he noticed Caleb's radio. "Where did you get that thing?" "It was in the cave along with all the other stuff we found," explained Caleb. Rickton nodded his head slightly. "The last time I saw something like that was years ago, back at the ranch in Texas when I was a kid," continued Rickton. "Your great-grandfather Jacob used to play with radios and things like that. At least until our generator finally died on us. He kept it running for many, many years, and he used to make his own fuel for it too. I remember him listening to other people talking on the radio from all over the world. I really missed listening to it. Do you think anyone still has radios like that?" that work?" asked Nico. "Hard to say. It certainly looks like Caleb found one, so maybe somebody else out there has a radio too," speculated Rickton. Stephen and the others were already at the cave and nearly done loading up all the crates. Stephen and Uriah had just finished loading the last case of ammunition onto the wagon, as Daniels was busy cutting several lengths of rope with his knife to secure the cases onto the wagon. Uriah finished what he was doing to take a few minutes to look at the area around the cave. "I wonder how many more of these bunkers are out here, Joseph, that we don't know about," wondered Uriah, pacing around the woods as if trying to imagine the size of the bunker below the ground. "Hard to say, but I would guess there are probably many," continued Daniels, continuing to tie down the crates. "Whoever built this one sealed it up well too. These guns look brand new. Every one of these cases must have been sealed airtight. There's not a speck of rust or corrosion on anything in there. There are also a lot of tools and equipment we can use, like the solar lamps, lighters, matches, knives, and even binoculars. We'll have to make more trips out later to get the rest," reasoned Uriah, who had stopped next to Stephen, placing his hand on his shoulder. "You did good to tell us about this, you and Caleb both," reassured Uriah. "I know, we would have told you about it, eventually," explained Stephen. "Joseph, I just wonder," mumbled Uriah, looking at the crates loaded up on the wagon, "if this is such a good idea." "What do you mean?" asked Daniels. "You know what I mean," continued Uriah. "Remember the stories they told us when we were kids, about the years that followed the cataclysm, and how people were shooting each other for food and water, and how they had to use guns to protect the ranch from looters that came by?" "Yeah, I remember." "Well, I'm just afraid we might be taking a step backward by taking these guns and using them against the Scavengers, that's all," speculated Uriah. "I don't see it that way, Uriah," remarked Daniels. "We have a duty to protect our families and friends from these Scavengers who just want to take from others. Perhaps, with these guns, they will think twice about stealing from anybody else for a while." "Why do they want to steal from others anyway?" asked Stephen. "Why don't they just do what we do, and grow their own food and make their own things?" "Because, Stephen, sometimes folks find it easier to just take from others, rather than doing any of the work themselves," suggested Daniels, as silence fell between them. "Okay. Well then, guys, we are loaded and ready to get back to the house," piped Daniels. "I wonder where the others are. They should have been here by now." "Do you think we should wait for them?" asked Stephen, looking over at his dad and Daniels. Daniels shrugged his shoulders slightly, and then looked over at Uriah. "I say we get going and take these back now. We'll meet up with them ahead on the trail anyway," he urged. Uriah looked at the crates that were loaded onto the wagon, then turned and took a long look around the woods and down the trail to the south. "I agree, let's get going, but first let's make sure we cover the entrance up again. Stephen, you said Caleb will be able to find this place without you, is that right?" he asked. "Oh yeah, Caleb will be able to find it," assured Stephen. "He's the one who marked the rocks over there in the meadow," he said, pointing to one of the large boulders near the trail, with black arrows etched into the sides. Several minutes later, as the three men headed back up the trail to the camp, they saw the other wagon with Rickton and the boys approaching from the opposite direction. Daniels waited until Rickton and the two boys were a little closer. "Well, will you look at that? There they are, and about time too," piped Daniels, loud enough so the others could hear him ahead. "Where have you three been?" "Sorry, it took a little longer for Nico and me to get the wagon ready. Plus, Caleb hesitated. I had some last-minute things to pack up." "Well, we better get started loading up this wagon. We'll meet you three back at the camp," said Rickton, flipping up the reins again to coax the horses to get moving. "Very well," shouted Uriah. "Be careful, and we'll see you in a little while." Rebecca Elgin had just finished feeding little Nathan his lunch when she heard a knock at the door. "That better not be Gina or Sarah coming over to convince me to change my mind about Martha," thought Rebecca, as she went to the door and opened it up. "Good afternoon, madam. My name is Serge Rolando. I would like to speak with your husband. Is he at home?" asked the pudgy man, standing at the doorway. "Just a moment, I'll go get him," replied Rebecca, curious about this stranger, as she walked back to the room where Elijah was still trying to console Martha. Rebecca stood quietly in the hallway waiting until Elijah noticed her. "There is a stranger at the door who's asking to speak with you," said Rebecca. "Who is it?" Elijah asked. Rebecca shrugged her shoulders slightly. "He said his name was Rolando," replied Rebecca. "I'll be back in a minute, Martha, and we can continue our talk some more," said Elijah. As Elijah walked back down the hallway into the main room of the house, standing inside the doorway of his home were 4 men, 3 of them holding rifles pointed at he and Rebecca, and one short pudgy man with a slight smirk on his face. "Hello, Mr. Elgin. My name is Serge Rolando, and I understand you and your father Zachariah are the leaders of this clan. Am I correct?" he asked. "Yes, we are. And why are you standing inside my house, and why are you pointing rifles at us?" "Well, Mr. Elgin, we are in need some basic supplies and a few other various items. As long as you and your family and other clan members cooperate with us, no one will need to be harmed," warned Rolando. "Now, call your children out here, please," ordered Rolando. Caleb and Nico had finished loading the wagon with the last of the ammo crates when Caleb heard a sound coming from his backpack, which was hanging off the side of the front of the wagon. "Caleb, your backpack is talking to you," laughed James Rickton, who was busy feeding the horses some fresh oats and checking their bridles. Caleb grabbed his backpack and unclipped the radio and pushed the button on the side. "Peter, is that you?" There was only static. Caleb, it's Peter. Can you hear me?" Peter repeated on the other end, nearly at a whisper. "Peter, yes, I can hear you. What's going on?" "Don't forget to push the button." "I hear you, Caleb. There's something going on over here. Some strange men have come into the camp in the last few minutes. They have rifles and the message stopped suddenly, replaced by static. Nico and Rickton had both stopped what they were doing and were listening as well. "Did Peter just say some men came into camp with rifles?" "Maybe he saw your dad and Joseph returning from the cave with the rifles," speculated Rickton, who appeared to be slightly nervous. "Call Peter back and ask him," insisted Rickton. Caleb pushed the button again. "Peter, what are you seeing? Is it my father and Mr. Daniels returning from the cave with the wagons and rifles? Is that what you are seeing?" he asked. "No, it's not them. It's several men on horseback, about a dozen of them as far as I can tell. Will and Little Bear are also here with me. We're all hiding, laying in the grass on the other side of the fence in the Daniels cornfield," explained Peter. "Tell us what you see, Peter." "They have Elder Elijah and his, oh no, Caleb, they have Martha with them, and her little brother too, and Elder Elijah is tied up on the back of a wagon," Peter continued. "They look like they have some men that are going through the Daniels house right now." "Has anyone been hurt?" "No, not from our camp. They do have a couple of men lying in the back of one of the other wagons. I think they might be dead. They're not moving, at least. It's hard to tell. There was one wounded man they carried inside the Daniels house." Caleb turned to James Rickton. "Do you think these men might be those scavengers we've been hearing about?" Caleb asked. Rickton nodded and motioned for the radio. "Can I?" Caleb handed the radio to Rickton. "Peter, this is Dad. You boys stay right where you are. Don't make any noise. Keep an eye on everything you see, okay? We are almost done loading the wagon here, and we will be headed back as soon as we can. We will call you again in a few minutes when we are on the way," reassured Rickton, handing the radio back to Caleb as he finished up feeding the horses. "Caleb, Will and Little Bear want to tell Nico something, I think." "Hang on," squeaked Peter, holding the button to let them talk. As he did, the other 2 boys started to speak a few words in English, but quickly switched to Cherokee as they began to speak nervously to Nico over the radio. Nico listened intently, nodding his head several times, and then turned to Caleb as soon as they finished and whispered something in Caleb's ear. "Peter, can you describe the men who are tied up on the wagon next to Elder Elijah?" Caleb asked Peter. There was static. "Yeah, I see the other men. They've sat up now. I don't know who they are. One of them has long silvery black hair and the other man has sort of reddish-brown hair and is a little shorter than Elder Elijah," observed Peter. "It's hard for me to tell exactly. They are too far away. They have been moved over next to Elder Elijah now." Caleb turned back to Nico. Do you think you might know who these other men are? He asked. My little brother and Will said they recognized the two men in the back of the wagon. One of them is my Uncle Gray Eagle and the other is Will's dad, Jacob Waddy. Caleb, I believe that the men you are calling scavengers are the same men that were spotted by our lookouts this morning near my village, reasoned Nico. Caleb, Nico, and James Rickton stared at each other contemplating what to do next. Rickton sighed deeply as he turned away. Well, we're going to need more help, he muttered to himself, walking off towards the back of the wagon. Caleb, I know a way that we might be able to get some help. If I could use your radio for a minute to speak to my little brother, asked Nico. Caleb handed the radio to Nico, showing him the button. Nico pressed the button and spoke quietly to Will and his little brother for a moment in Cherokee, and then handed the radio back to Caleb. I told them to go get their horses and ride back to the village as fast as they can, and tell the others what they've seen. Then Will and Little Bear can guide the warriors from my village back to your camp to help out, Nico continued. What do you want to do, Caleb? Caleb almost felt as if he were having another one of his bizarre dreams, except that, this time, there was no older Caleb, mysterious girl, or anyone else. It was just him alone. He wished it were a dream, so that he could just wake up from it. Suddenly, Caleb remembered the last words old Caleb spoke to him in his vision. When the time is right, you will awaken, and the world you once knew will forever be changed. Now he understood what that meant. Should he take Nico up on his offer of help and possibly place his family along with the others in his camp in danger? Nico had reason himself to get involved. After all, these scavengers were also holding his uncle and his friend Will's dad hostage for some reason. They have their own guns now. They don't need to be afraid of these scavengers. With these guns, they would be evenly matched. However, the scavengers are holding Martha and her brother hostage. What if they got hurt somehow? He didn't want that to happen. Fear and confusion took over Caleb's thoughts as he sought to find a solution. Just then, Peter's voice came booming over the radio once again with news that added another dilemma to Caleb's decision. Caleb, this is Peter again. Are you there? I'm right here, Peter. What's going on? I'm afraid the scavengers now have your dad, Elder Daniels, as well as your brother Stephen. I just saw them being led over to the Daniels house by some of the strange men, reported Peter. Caleb shot a worried glance over at Nico. Nico, I hope your brothers can ride fast. Caleb pleaded to Nico, who nodded his head. Oh yeah, they'll make it. Don't worry about that, Nico grinned. Suddenly from behind them, they could hear a soft whistle and a loud clicking sound as they turned around and saw James Rickton holding a rifle in his hands that he had just removed from one of the open crates. All right, you two, it's time I teach you the basics of how to use a rifle, boomed Rickton, slapping a freshly loaded magazine into the bottom of the rifle. We just might need to use some of these before the day is over, he grinned.
You have been listening to Caleb Elgin, The Rise of the Clans by David E. Farmer. Also available on Amazon Kindle. More chapters coming soon. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. Bye-bye.